Citizen 12 is brought to you by Complexify, a social purpose corporation founded to support you living in alignment with your conscience and discerning what that is. Find out more at complexify.org. complexiphy.org.
Hello, citizens. My name is Paige Hulsey. I have a bit of a cold, which again is why you hear my voice sound like this. I hope it isn't too distracting.
And I'm Emily Bogen.
And this is episode 10 of the Citizen 12 podcast.
Citizen 12 is not a program or health treatment, but an inclusive place, common ground to share and learn. If you have not yet listened to episode 0, we invite you to do that. You'll get a good sense of what this show is about and hear our steps, which were inspired by Alcoholics Anonymous, and those can also be found through any of our sites.
A little more of a preface. This show, this content may stir stuff up for you. In some ways, that's part of the point, but also we acknowledge that this can be hard, uncomfortable, even disruptive. Please engage with us responsibly and don't be on your own with stuff. Be in touch if that's the right thing. We care about you. It's why we're making the show.
Our podcast is created in Seattle, Washington. We acknowledge this as Duwamish land and strive to honor the past, present, and future Indigenous lives here. Citizen 12 supports Duwamish tribal services by paying real rent. Find out more at realrentduwamish.org.
Today's show is our follow-up episode to episode 9, which was all about choices and decision-making. In our last show, we talked a good bit about barriers to responsible choosing and workarounds to navigate those barriers. Today, we're going to discuss some common pitfalls and hangups related to responsible, surrendered decision-making. Today, we have a whopping 5 of these common traps on today's lineup. Okay, so trap number 1. Aversion to discomfort. Emily just rolled her eyes. Is that okay for me to say?
Yes.
Just hearing the words aversion to discomfort reminds you of our sometimes debilitating aversion to discomfort. Is that what the eye roll was about?
It reminds me of myself. Yeah.
And, well...
Yes, and my debilitating aversion to discomfort.
So, clearly we're not saying that it's good to be uncomfortable or that we love being uncomfortable or value that. And this is more to talk about how problematic it is to have a diminished ability to proceed and live well through normal amounts of discomfort. Mm-hmm. Is that fair?
Yes.
This is our first trap for no particularly great reason. We actually agreed in writing this show that there wasn't really a logical order to these things, that all of these pieces kind of work together to present difficulty in making good decisions. But we definitely wanted to spend some time kind of just talking through how there are a few pieces of this, which includes avoiding disruption. So actually like taking action in our lives. So this is like not good decision making, but to avoid disruption rather than making a good choice.
Whenever I'm in a relationship with somebody, there's usually a million times when when I'm deciding what I want to communicate. And the more proximity you are with somebody, the closer proximity you have, to me, the more I have to assert my needs. There's always this bumping up against not really wanting to share my like shape or my preferences, my needs, whatever you call it, or whatever just sort of thing is coming up, that I get the insight that probably needs to be shared, because it's honest. And I think that kind of happens under the principle of honesty, like this particular thing I need to share about me, being myself. But just kind of either knowing or fearing, or both, that it's going to cause a disruption and, affect the other person, affect whatever relationship we have, and not wanting to move forward with that.
And really the discomfort of it.
The discomfort of whatever disruption it is. Yeah. It's not so much
being able to say the words, or and I'm going to assert that all of this kind of happens subconsciously. It's not like you've sat down and said to yourself, if I say this thing, I may be uncomfortable. It's kind of like just how it is that you proceed to try to avoid discomfort.
It depends. I would say two things. One, I've become able to be more conscious of it. And when it's something that keeps coming up and I keep avoiding it because of discomfort, then it becomes something I'm very conscious of.
Sure. And I wasn't saying you and not me.
Well, I'm talking about me. Yeah.
No, I got that. But the way I said that kind of made it sound like I didn't know about that. And that's, of course, not the case. I really, through fourth step inventory, was how I started to come to terms with how much action I had taken to try to protect comfort, and skewed, right? Because even in the example you're giving, having the people in our lives know who we really are in the long run actually supports good working relations, which includes being comfortable. It's this like kind of short-sighted, near, those like acute, I'm trying to think of a good word, tight turnaround. It's like the, immediate consequences, like a little bit of discomfort to have good communication pays off, dividends later, but less mature us didn't have access to that, couldn't. And I still have, it's a practice for me to notice when I am prioritizing my comfort rather than my conscience or some spirit. For me, comfort isn't a spiritual principle. And again, I'm not saying it's not important to be adequately, appropriately comfortable. Of course it is. But I'm saying, and being responsible for that, I have been disproportionately averse to discomfort. So much so that it has blocked me from taking good right action.
So you know that this is the definition of what cowardice is. An extreme aversion to discomfort.
That's interesting. I
brought it up with you before in our conversations of how that's one of my biggest issues is cowardice.
Well, I do think we've talked about that before. And I think of my working definition for cowardice is it's more about being brave, but it is very much what you're saying, which is this acknowledgement of the discomfort, but then proceeding anyway to do what needs to be done. Which, yes, I think we both really share as something we admire and are interested in growing toward.
Overcoming cowardice.
Yeah.
Overcoming
being
the aversion.
And being brave.
Being brave.
Yeah.
Having courage. I love courage.
Another component to this aversion to discomfort is our occasions where you should talk about this because you're the one who had an example for this. So balancing, how am I going to look back and feel about myself later? And do you have a good example for that? I can think of one.
Okay.
Well, it was around a breakup, and it seemed like it was the right thing to do to separate from my partner at the time. And I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but we had a vegetable garden together in our home, in our yard. And I really thought, well, how will I live with myself to sacrifice the vegetable garden. Part of me wants to like excuse this by saying how young I was, and I was younger, but this has been a repeat flavor in my life that I have gotten confused about priorities. Now, in the clear light of day, of course, like making good decisions about my life and relationships, vegetable garden's not really high in there. Like my conscience isn't really talking to me about those kind of like material things.
Right.
But I did have concern. Part of what prevented me from like abiding by my conscience there was this like concern about future potential regret about the vegetable garden.
Well, first I just want to say that I admire your love for vegetables and gardens. Like I think I admire that prioritizing that, but I understand what you're saying. And I have a similar story. Just, yeah.
Well, and let's touch on that it isn't that doing that kind of information gathering, as we said in the last episode, considering the ramifications of a choice, fine, good, in right size.
Mm-hmm.
Having a fear of having regret in the future, probably not, well, I can say with confidence, not what my conscience is asking me to be concerned about.
Well, so I was talking to someone the other day. She was telling me that she was afraid of regret. And I said, well, that might be a good opportunity to think about how you make decisions. If we have in place something that's solid, something that we trust,
like a framework
to make decisions by, I believe it's a lot less likely that at the end of our lives or at the end of some sort of cycle or era, we'll be in much regret. I don't foresee that if we have this thing that we trust. I think that I more likely see us saying, no matter what happened, I stood by these values, I stood by these principles, and that's what's most important to me. And I think that's what we're doing right now.
That very much matches my experience. Mm-hmm. What I see that since adopting a practice of the third step, which is still how I see this, I do experience less anguish or worry or rehashing because I actually can. I'm not saying every choice I've made, I've said this before, every choice I've made since taking a third step has been consistent with my conscience. But for the choices that I know I did make in like abiding by my conscience, I do feel good about those. Even if somehow it didn't go perfectly, it really is the best way I know how to proceed.
Absolutely. And I'm not even going to say that regret isn't present. So I did the same thing as you, Paige, is I had to decide whether or not to end a relationship, and definitely took in a lot of information in order to make that decision. And I did feel regret. But that was because I think that we still have all of these other parts of us that have voices, right? Like your love for your vegetable garden. I'm sure that never went away. So, and for me, my love for X, Y, or Z that I had in that relationship, it never went away. But because I had this foundation of, this is why I'm making this decision. These things are why. These have the most weight. And having those in my pocket whenever I felt the regret is what got me through that. So regret wasn't the last stop. And I think that that's what people fear, is that like that's where they'll end up.
That's interesting. I also am noticing people have different terminology for it, but one of my friends calls it the quiet knowing or a deep knowing. And I have observed people be confused about what they think they know. And I am very personally leery of certainty. I think certainty is actually pretty not great. Actually, last episode we talked about being lightly attached, but that doesn't take away from my experience that there have been times when I can access, and I strive for this with my third step practice, a quiet sense, a quiet knowing that I'm on the right track. We've talked about this before.
We have, and I love that you're reiterating it.
And it's what I know you had when you're talking about ending that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, you're talking about regret, or even me, the regret with the vegetable garden. For me, that's not regret. Some sadness, sure, something else. For me, that is a very distinct thing from regret. But yeah, it's not like my sense was to end the relationship and then it was just all like fun party times. There were sadness and grieving and pain and all kinds of things that didn't, for me, that didn't cloud. It never got to the point where I was like, oh, so maybe I shouldn't have done the breakup.
Right. So my experience was a little bit different. Mine, I would come to you a lot as a friend, right? Like, here's new information I'm getting, all of this grief. And does this mean that I made a mistake?
Yes.
Should I regret?
Yes.
And that's kind of, I think, what I'm talking about.
Very
and
common.
You being like,
well, let's look.
And just because you feel like absolute death does not mean that you didn't follow your conscience.
Yeah. I mean, and that was the after school special bit in our last episode, that yes, sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel good. And of course, having sadness or pain can shade or hide our confidence in having proceeded the right way,
and
or
not
a
just
right way.
Not just sadness or pain. Sometimes like shit hits the fan, or like an external
big real life consequences.
Right.
Yeah. We're going to jump into trap number 2, attachment. So obviously we could say that aversion to discomfort could also be seen just as an attachment to comfort. But this attachment business is bigger than just comfort. And I find that I can be attached to kind of a range of things, my identity, how I look, my comfort, physical results, or, like we can be attached to how our home looks, or that we're married or not married, or have a job or have some income. All of these are potential for attachment. I think the thing we thought we would call out here is that when this attachment gets outsized is when it can interfere with good, responsible choosing. So we talked before we've talked a bunch about snipping attachments. I think I have mentioned my meditation for actually identifying. Well, and in the last episode, I talked about the table meditation and putting things on the table. I think you can probably hear that's a lot like severing my attachment to the outcome. I just don't think we can stress enough, though, that like a misshapen or outsized attachment is going to pose a problem for surrendering how we live. And really, we see that part of what happens here is that we get our wants and needs collapsed and kind of confused. And this happens for all different kinds of reasons, including that some of us really have had times and may still have times where our needs aren't being met. And that can really torque our wants and needs and get it all confused. Mm-hmm. I think we both have had times in our lives where that was part of what was going on. Mm-hmm. And then there are times when we totally, absolutely are having our needs met and we are still having like a warped attachment to things we want and relating to them as though they're things that we need. I would say romantic attention has certainly been in that category for me. That there have been times in my life where I certainly had an adequate quotient of romantic attention, and I was still operating and living as though I needed more than that. Mm-hmm. Like an attachment to a high quantity of romantic attention.
Mm. Yeah, this is a hot topic.
Which part?
Well, I'm like dating And there is a lot of confusion here for me, because when it's just you, you're responsible. I'm responsible for meeting my needs, right? And then when you have someone else enter the picture, all of a sudden, like, do you have new needs? Or, and that's, I think, where they get collapsed for me.
I'm not even quite sure I know what you mean.
So, yeah, because it's really...
So I hear maybe things are a little sticky.
I am the voice of the person who's a little bit stuck in this area, I think.
Well, maybe it would actually help to bring in the other point on this that we thought we would address, which is actually how this really ties into what I think of as first step stuff. In my book, the only time I really have to have attachments is when I'm trying to manage something. So our first step is accepting that we have limited power and that attempting to manage our lives has not solved all our problems. And wrapped up in that for me in practice is like seeing and really coming to terms with the futility of managing some things. Like that managing isn't the way to make things. Like for me, managing is in contradiction to responsible choosing. In fact, to be interested in managing, I have to be attached to some kind of outcome. So those are like opposing approaches.
Well, can you share then how it might look for you today if you were dating someone new? Because I know I'm not the only one here who struggles so much with like managing in new relationships and having like attachments coming up in new relationships, attachment to outcome. And there are genuine needs that you want to express and you want to like.
Can you be more? Well, that was a long run of things, but I do want to hear what do you mean there are needs that you want to express?
Well, you have to be yourself, right? Like you have to show up as yourself, right? And so that's like one thing that's clear.
Okay, well, actually, that isn't how I would say that. I have come to value being myself, but I lived a lot of my life not being interested in that at all. And I've observed that a lot of people are not being themselves or not interested in being themselves. So, and this is like being a little, fussy about the wording, but I think it matters. You don't have to be yourself. In fact, it's kind of like if you have come to be interested in being yourself, it actually is going to include not really being attached to outcomes.
Yeah, and I can see that more. I mean, I can like feel strongly and at the same time know completely well that I'll just be fine without somebody. But like, can you share what navigating this might look like for you now with the tools that you have? No, I didn't tell you that I was going to ask you that. So I have not, you have no...
I think it's that maybe I need a narrower question. Like, how do you date and not be attached? Is that that's such a broad question.
Okay. And I hope that this is useful, but yeah. I'm going on a tangent. But okay. I think this is like, who doesn't have this issue? So, okay, you start to date somebody and you start to have all of these things come up where like they're not, like you want them to be doing certain things in order for you to feel a certain way. Or like you... Like, it's uncomfortable. Here, scratch that. It's uncomfortable to date because, like, a lot of stuff comes up, right? Like, you're not sure what's going to happen in the future. You're not sure about who this person is. And so, let's say that somebody wants to spend a ton of time with you. And you or they don't want to spend a ton of time with you, and you want to spend more time with them than they want to spend with you. Is it a need that you have that they spend more time with you? Is it a need that you have a certain amount of, you see as someone you're dating a certain amount of time?
Okay.
Or is that a want or an attachment?
Okay, so I am going to confess, part of me is like tempted to call cut and say this is too messy to just do live on the show. And I'm going to proceed through it and see how we do.
Okay. I also am tempted to call cut.
So there's another thing I want to share with our audience. We really strive to actually not do hypotheticals. My whole life experience tells me that talking in hypotheticals.
This isn't a hypothetical.
Well, but you're framing it as a hypothetical
because it's embarrassing.
I got that, but that is that's part of why this is being a little convoluted.
Okay,
and also. I know I can't answer that question for you about you and your life. So when you at some point are ready to share with me or with us about how you have untangled your confusion about the difference between wants and needs in this department, which I suspect if it needs to happen, it'll happen. Now I might have something relevant to share from my own personal experience, but I'm not really sure. So I'll just talk a little bit about it and we'll see.
Okay.
When I first started seeing my now husband, I assumed that it would be a casual, mostly not emotional fling. I knew him. I was casually acquainted with him, slightly more than casually. We've been part of the same community for a long time. We know each other through our coffee shop. But as I recall, I was attempting to practice a third step at the time, and I was committed to remaining unattached to my ideas about what there was ahead for me, as I do in my life in all areas, striving. This is what I be striving for, right, is to not be attached to any outcomes and to take life as it comes and to proceed in harmony with my values and principles and my conscience as it happens. And pretty early, there was some evidence that there was the possibility that this be something other than just a casual, non-emotional fling. And I can see now, if I had stayed attached to it just being casual, it may have precluded building what we have since built. I suspect similarly, if I had been attached to it being a very serious, significant relationship, that could have altered how I interacted with him. This is really what I was talking about with attachment. Was any of that even related to?
I think it's an answer to the question. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's hard to frame the question, but it's like so specifically. But yeah, I think that's exactly what I was sort of asking.
So, I freely acknowledge that living lightly attached and these practices that help me stay loosely attached, it's a big deal. It's like contrary to our drives and urges, my drives and urges, my ideas, external, it's like all the stuff we've been talking about in the last episode. It's not a casual thing to pull back from our attachments. And it's like paradoxical, because it's not that let's say I had come into dating my now husband, his name's Ben, with this idea we're going to get married. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I know for myself, being overly attached to an outcome spells trouble. It like diminishes my ability to listen to my conscience and be like, I think of myself like being poised at the ready to go in whatever direction is needed next.
Yeah, I feel like that's pretty supportive and makes a lot of sense.
Trap number 3, habit. We touched on habit in our last episode. but we're bringing it up again because there's just no denying the power that it has to shape how we make choices. And we thought it was a good occasion to bring up some related matters that we haven't touched on before.
I don't know if anyone has noticed, or, depending on how familiar you are with like the steps, but they are very related to cognitive behavioral therapy. And the core tenet of CBT is that our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors intersect constantly, and they're just like in this constant dance. And what that means is we develop patterns, we develop habits, habitual behaviors, and so some of our thoughts are very familiar to us, and our behaviors are very familiar, and our emotions are very familiar.
And that they kind of play together,
yes.
come together, and get like lumped together and have habits all together.
Absolutely. And that's kind of the intervention of the therapy itself is sort of familiarizing people with that process and helping them to break it up and make space and to look in on it and be like a voyeur of their process.
Even to just observe that phenomenon in themselves.
Yes, exactly.
Yep. And if I'm not mistaken, in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, we don't begin by changing the feelings, the emotions, in that triad collection of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We don't start with the feelings. And in my observation, many of us hope to first change the feelings that we're having, hoping that somehow later the thoughts will just change themselves, or that the behaviors will just change themselves.
Right. Absolutely.
So my experience is that changing the behavior and or the thoughts are actually the first things that have to happen for me to have real change.
And that process usually is very like simultaneous. We attempt to change our thoughts. We attempt to understand understand our beliefs, our core beliefs that are driving our behaviors and our feelings. And at the same time, we try to like think about what those behaviors are that are connected. And so it's not, I haven't seen it so much be one before the other, but what I see more is that people attempting these things at the same time.
Okay. I think of this as related to, and for some of you, this may be cliche. You may have heard this many times. And for other of our listeners, you may never have heard this. But someone said to me a very long time ago, we act our way into right thinking around here. You know, like this is how we're going to do it. We don't try to get our thinking straightened out so that then we later act right. We actually take good right action and trust that our minds will follow. And that was very useful. Now, I'm not saying that's easy or simple even, but developing some confidence that taking good action, and I'm going to use something like maybe even like getting a good night's sleep. I think I thought if I was convinced that a good night's sleep was valuable, I would do it. And in reality, actually just going to bed on time and getting up on time was access to like learning to value getting a good night's sleep. So for me, it really was like some faith that just getting a good night's sleep would lead to some good, desirable deal there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it takes time for our thoughts to catch up. And if we're waiting for our thoughts to change, like you said, that can be very problematic. During the process, though, it can be really helpful to understand what the thoughts are doing.
Totally.
And like why they're so resistant.
And make space for it. Yeah. So, go ahead.
So this might be a good time to kind of talk about accuracy. And so, or like when we're evaluating, when we're thinking, and a really common one is, for me too, just like thoughts about self-worth. And if there's, if what you're more commonly attuned to the thought that you don't have a lot of self-worth, then it becomes more believable. If it's something that you think of often, or, you know, if the core belief is that you lack self-worth, and it comes up a lot for you, it's familiar to you. And so it's like Paige talked about in a previous episode about like these grooves being created in, you know, the more we do something, the more automatic it becomes. And in CBT, we actually have this like this concept, the construct of automatic thoughts, and they become automatic, and they just sometimes seem more accurate. And in doing the steps for me, what's been so hard is that I get kind of stuck in, I know that this thought is not helping me move forward in any sort of decision making. It's not constructive.
Like it's noise.
It's noise.
Interference.
It's interference. It's causing pain, yada, yada, yada. But it's so familiar to me that it's hard for me to switch gears.
So I'm going to actually pull back a little bit, and we'll circle back to this because this is totally related to this trap, this habit trap. But let's talk about neural pathways. So I shy away from talking about neuroscience because by and large, it seems like when non-neuroscientists talk about neuroscience, it's not great. And I am not a neuroscientist. And I feel more comfortable talking kind of poetically about neuroscience. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I actually did talk about that rutted pathway, like that well-worn path on the show, but it is something I talk about in life a lot. Mm-hmm. And for me, they're really synonymous. Established neural pathways, ways of thinking, which I think you're referring to as core beliefs. And I'm going to give an example. I didn't know that I had this thought that ran again and again until I was a pretty mature grown-up. But at some point, I caught a glimpse of how frequently I said to myself, I don't matter. Mm-hmm. It was so deeply ingrained and entrenched that I would say to myself, unconsciously, subconsciously, I don't matter. I couldn't even hear it. It was only through like step treatment and work and effort that I could even catch a glimpse of how alive I don't matter was in my life, how much it drove. Mm-hmm. So if we say I don't matter was a core belief, it was also like my most well-worn path. Mm-hmm. Everything that happened sparked that I don't matter trip on the wagon down that path, right? Mm-hmm. And it was like, a well-worn path. Mm-hmm. Now, we do know now, are coming to see that in the past, we thought that our brains didn't really change. We had this idea, the scientific community thought that neural pathways, neurons were like kind of done at some point. And now we know that that's not the case. Neural pathways can keep growing and changing by and large. And that this is part of how we can continue to learn into adulthood. Mm-hmm. And yes, we know that learning looks different in adults than it does in children, and that there are periods where the brain is more or less plastic than other times, but that there is growth, development, healing, learning, changing happening in our neural pathways. Mm-hmm. And we bring this up because these are not separate. How we think, what we feel, how we behave, these are inseparable from our neural pathways, all related. And knowing that that it's possible to take another path. So for me, learning that I could start to say something other, learning that I could start to say something other than I don't matter, helped actually start to say something other than I don't matter.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really grateful to report that that path, it barely ever gets used anymore.
Mm.
I mean, really.
Mm.
And I'm trying to think what year that was. 2012, I think, that I
Mm-hmm.
really got a hold of that, like identified that on the map, how deep I had lived as though I didn't matter,
Mm.
had
Wow.
thought it, and how it had shaped my behavior.
Yeah. I mean, that's our approach here is really taking advantage of the flexibility of the neural pathways. It's very supportive. Like you said, it works hand in hand, and it's just very hopeful. Your story is very hopeful. I love that. I mean, that's a huge change. That's a huge change.
Well, it was a fundamental, I mean, it felt like an entire rearrangement.
Yeah.
I may talk more about it at some other point.
Mm-hmm.
For now, an aspect of this that I thought was important to cover here related to habit is this how this confusion that so many of us have about, like, well, I'm going to just say it. Well, that's just who I am. So I think that there was a time when, like, those thoughts and feelings and behaviors, I just thought of them as just who I was. And now, having had the opportunity to, like, forge new paths, literally, I think, form new alternative neural pathways that can say something other than I don't matter, shows me that I don't matter is not at all who I am.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was in there as a path I had gone down countless times. That didn't mean that that's who I am. Another piece of this path business and habit and making new choices. So that's kind of why this is relevant here, right? Is that we talk about checking afresh as a workaround. Well, if we're just so deeply entrenched in a habit, it might not seem like we have access to doing something outside of our habit. And we used the analogy of a crowbar.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of actually getting a chance to do something new, maybe even checking afresh, it does require me being present and getting that objectivity you talked about in, like, even identifying that this is a thing that's happening in me. And then there's still a lot more to the story. Like, just getting the crowbar in, and you actually said it when I talked about the table meditation, just putting all the things on the table, it doesn't actually, like, that may not actually change anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I can put everything on the table and then still get reattached or proceed the way I was going to proceed before. And in my experience, to forge a new pathway, it includes getting the crowbar in and then doing something new, whether that's thinking a new thought or taking a new action. In my sense, it does seem like I have more access to doing a new action, and then the thoughts come. I don't know. Maybe I'm not sure about that.
I mean, in my experience, this can be such a daunting idea, or, doing something new, meaning, and that what that means to me is doing something that is very much out of my comfort zone. And I would try to prep myself with the, kind of lingering in the thought area, right? But that really only goes so far. And there is a time when you, like, rubber meets the road and you gotta do the new thing.
Yep, move our feet.
Yeah. And it's not like I don't feel like I've ever been asked to do something so drastic that I can't handle it, or
asked by your conscience, you mean? Mm-hmm.
Anything like
or
that.
God.
Right. So it's never as,
it's never as impossible as maybe it seemed before examination.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And
I agree. And not to say that we haven't been, I've talked about when it was time to not smoke anymore. That there was a time when that was incredibly threatening and maybe even seemed impossible. And I had quit smoking before and then smoked again. And, in some ways that made it seem like it was impossible to quit smoking. But when I got the sense now it's time to not, I think it's time to not smoke now, I had access to it. Mm-hmm. I did have access to it.
Mm-hmm. Right. There seems to be, the harder part is just how the bewilderment of the attachment, I think, of no, this is what I do. This is who I am.
Well,
this
that
is
would
what
be a
I
barrier.
Need. Right.
Being no, there's only one path.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to stay on that path.
Mm-hmm.
That is going to preclude doing other things.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I both have utilized a lot of tools to help break that up, including talking to other people and getting it all out on the table. So we're not on our own with that. It's a lot. Mm-hmm. Saying that out loud
mm-hmm.
makes it a lot easier to hear how untrue it is.
Right. Exactly. And quitting smoking is a great example of that because it includes the fear of the discomfort, and I think with smoking in particular, it's the deprivation, the fear of deprivation, not getting that, not having what you are, your object of comfort, right? And then all of these things that we're going to talk about. So it's a pretty good example. I also quit smoking and it happened when it happened.
I thought I might also include a note here about it's sort of like timing. So frequently someone will call me kind of in the heat of some distress. And I love that they're calling me and that they're not being on their own. Really, it has saved my life to just not be on my own. It's a really good thing. It's a great skill to learn and to develop relationships and community where we can, have that and not be on our own together. But frequently in the heat of the distress or confusion or struggling over making a decision, my sense is that indicates that it's not the right time. It's
mm-hmm.
not a good time right
mm-hmm.
in the heat of it to try to figure it out or work it out or analyze or assess or process.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always interesting to me how it takes someone from the outside to notice that.
Right.
And I've been on both sides of it. I can actually, the last time I remember it happening, I think I had called my mom, and I don't remember what it was that I was stirred up about, but my mom pointed out, "Oh, honey, you're all in the heat of it. We're not going to figure this out tonight. Why don't you, have some food and maybe have a bath, and we'll, I trust that you'll come back to this when you have all of your resources at your disposal." And I'm grateful to say, for a bunch of reasons, I was like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for having, being clued in enough and loving enough to say that to me in a way that I can hear it. There was a time when even somebody saying that, I think would have been really threatening, and I would have thought they were just trying to get rid of me or something. Mm-hmm. And my matters seemed so urgent that I would have been like, no, this does need to get addressed tonight. Yes, whatever. It's 11 o'clock at night, or, it wasn't 11 when I called her, but there have been times in my life where even in the middle of the night, it seemed like, I was in the habit of, discipline. So I thought we had actually planned to talk about discipline. Did I miss my notes about this? This is so critical. I don't see it. Okay, so discipline. I used to be in the habit of being undisciplined, mentally, emotionally, behaviorally. That's the reality. I am so grateful to say I have developed discipline in all of those areas. And one of the gifts of having some discipline is to be able to recognize, even if it takes some assistance, that hammering something out right when it's come up may not be the right thing. Mm. Being unattached, lightly attached to the timing of hashing through or resolving something.
Right. That's a hard one for me. Yeah, because when you want to hash things out, there's usually like some definite like intense emotionality and anxiety, some like you're perceiving like a threat, and you need to fix it, and a lot of managing comes into play, and so it isn't like an easy task, but
to learn to kind of set it aside and come back to it at a later time.
And yeah, and like you said, the idea of dismissing it can even seem like impossible.
Well, and I want to be clear, I wouldn't use the word dismiss. Mm-hmm. I like the words setting aside. Mm-hmm. I really am empowered by that mm-hmm. term, setting aside. For me, even in my kind of most riled up, considering setting something aside, because to me that means it's temporary. Dismissing makes it sound like we're never going to come back to it.
But you said that in when you were saying you have perceived being dismissed.
Oh,
right.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Well, yes. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think that's why I'm saying the language is important, because setting something aside can seem a little like dismissing it.
Right.
Which is why I think it's important for me to frame it as setting aside. Mm-hmm. And the truth is sometimes in the heat of an upset, there might be something I tell myself I'm setting aside. And then, a few days later when I've cooled down and I go to look and see if something needs doing, there wasn't anything really that needed to get addressed. Like maybe I was even confused about what was going on. And so really, ultimately it just is dismissed. Mm-hmm. But often there really are things in there that are worth picking back up at a later time. Mm. But I really have come to appreciate the difference it makes to process, I guess is an okay word, stuff when I do have my wits about me, when it is kind of like in the clear light of day, when, with a cooler head.
Yeah. I've come to you in those moments, and I have always appreciated the permission you gave me to set it aside and consider perhaps that there's something beyond all of this mess inside of me, right? Like
life exists outside of this snarl,
little bundle,
temporary snarl.
Yeah, and it's hard at first, I think, when you're getting in the practice of this, or even now for me, whenever it's just highly emotional, to give myself the permission to set it aside.
For me, that was the formation of a new habit mm-hmm. that I maybe am saying I'm still building. Mm-hmm. I count on other people to support me, not just digging in and engaging and stirring more stuff up in the heat of a thing.
Yeah. I laugh because there's still times where I'll call you or someone and, be like, yeah, you're right. Not now. This is not the time. And then I hang up and I'm like, okay, like let's figure this out.
Back to the snarl.
How am I going to get this? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for admitting that. I think that's lovely.
It'd just be too much of a lie to not.
I'm not saying I have a perfect record now for leaving things alone when it's time to leave them alone, but I can say I have had a tremendous amount of relief. I'll actually share that. So I like to read when I fall asleep, and we're going to talk about sleep soon in our episode about meditation. That's going to be our next episode 11. But I like to read. I read on my iPad with like the dark screen background, and sometimes I turn the iPad on and the dark screen and I read like 3 sentences and I fall asleep. It's wonderful. But I'm sharing this because there was a time when I actually wondered if reading to fall asleep was a crutch that I was over depending on. And I got kind of concerned that maybe I had forgotten how to fall asleep without reading, and that didn't seem ideal. And I kind of came to that developing a tool for myself and the discipline to really, no matter what is going on in my life or the world, be able to direct my attention to what I'm reading so effectively that I can fall asleep when it's time to go to sleep is actually a beautiful asset, a beautiful thing that I have fought for, sort of, like a new path. I did not always fall asleep easily. I'm not saying I take it. I mean, obviously, I'm not taking it for granted, but I also want to say I'm not assuming it'll always be this way. But I'm very grateful that I have had years of ability to, when it's time to go to sleep, Mm-hmm. And for me, this really is related to discipline and forming new habits and changing old habits.
Mm-hmm. Trap number 4, genuine confusion as a barrier. Initially, when I brought up, hey, what about just genuine confusion? Like really just being confused about what to do, how to proceed. Paige was like, okay, I'll write it down, but put it in quotations because she was like, I'm not really sure that that's a thing.
Okay, that's not quite.
It's not. Okay.
That's not quite it. Okay. That it's not that I. It's not. So I guess my consideration was about genuine. So clearly, confusion is a real thing.
Okay.
I think it.
It's a genuine piece.
Yeah, yeah, because I can think of one friend who really has come to terms with that they do confused almost as like a shtick, habit, defense mechanism. They kind of like be confused as a way of being to like protect themselves from having to be responsible.
Okay.
So, and because that is so rarely talked about or addressed or noticed, I think it might be more of interest to me to talk about confusion as not genuine and as like a barrier itself. Mm-hmm. For myself, like it's a totally off the hook. That's not a good way of saying it. If I'm genuinely confused, how can I be responsible? Like it's like a final, I'm not responsible. So I think it's a thing to be very careful with. And my suspicion is that, well, it's not just my suspicion, it's my experience that by and large, when I have thought I was confused, later it looks like there was something else going on. And I'm going to tell you what it often for me is, let's see if I can say it in a way that makes sense. So, okay, I'm just going to say it how I always say it. I use the example of choosing classes to register for in school. So when I was in college and it was time to like choose which classes to register for, I would like do this process of decision making, take into consideration my degree plan and timing and money and the schedule and all the things. And I would like put it all on the table and really strive to be lightly attached. You know, I had ideas like I should take all the credits and maximize my dollar and make it be easy. And you know what I mean? Like it was very easy to generate attachments around which classes I registered for, but I really was in a practice of attempting to snip those attachments to make space for my conscience to come in and show me something new. I now, looking back, suspect that when I thought I was confused, I really don't know how to proceed. Often it was that there was some other area of life that needed addressing that wasn't connected to the thing I thought I needed clarity about. Mm-hmm. And I don't really know how else to say it other than that. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, God, tell me which classes to register for. And I'm like only listening for what classes to register for. And I'm not getting the information I want or any information about classes. And to me, that like equated to real confusion about which classes to register for. And then, well, really what happened is I like backed up to reassess, is it real that I'm not having a connection here and don't know how to proceed? And for me, it was no. It was that there were other things in my life not related to school that needed addressing. And that it was like those other seemingly unrelated things were just what was next for me to address. So I don't want to be dismissive about when we truly don't know. It's that my experience is that that isn't really what has been happening for me when I have thought I was confused. And the closest I can think of in my personal experience to confusion is kind of like when I feel like my sense is to just wait and like stay the course. Because staying the course in my life seemed so peaceful. Like for a long time practicing the third step, when I would put the stuff on the table, in some ways it was like, okay, great. We're going to change all of this. Everything that you're doing is all wrong. And all of this needs to be happening differently. And so like there was a time when it seemed like practicing the third step meant making very violent changes. And then as I grew and my life changed, when I would put things on the table, I did start to get the message like, just stay the course you're on. And I did maybe have some thoughts like, well, maybe this means I'm not really hearing clearly, which I think maybe felt like confusion. But again, in retrospect, I don't think that that's really what it was. So do you think I mean, I'm not like you have to beat me or prove something here, but do you?
No, I mean, honestly, hearing that just makes me feel sad.
Oh.
Yeah, because this reminds me of when around the time when we first met, and you would say that if I was confused about what God was saying, that there is like some, there's blockage, right? And just it makes me sad that I have that still. And I mean, I'm not going to try to say like I have less. Who gives a shit? Like if there's blockage, there's blockage. And I think like we all know how it feels like to have it. And it sucks. And I want to say like I have genuine confusion because there's confusion present. And like I'm taking the time out of my day to like meditate for an hour or whatever, and trying to offer myself up to hear what God wants, and still just sometimes just not sure about like what the reply is. And And it's not that I'm not aware that there's like something else. There definitely there's a sense that like there's something not quite right here. And in those moments I do like I take the at times I will like have taken the confusion to you. Perhaps it's to you. I say like I'm not sure. And I guess what's helpful from what you just said is that in those moments, like to direct myself to if there's something else, that needs to be addressed. But it's just difficult because how far back do you have to go? And like that can feel daunting. Like, it can feel almost paralyzing because you want to be able to proceed with your life. You want to be able to live your life. You don't want to be like stuck in your apartment, frozen, not knowing what to do next, right? And like, I guess it's just been my process that like either I just do whatever, I end up making a choice, and it's never like, I no longer have it's not like the worst thing in the world or whatever. Like, okay, maybe I make the wrong choice, or maybe I make a mistake, whatever. Like, but the stuff that like still needs to be addressed that causes blockages, it's not that I have to like search it. Usually just sort of, I guess it kind of just, it does just show up, right? Like it's not as daunting as it might seem, but I do know what it feels like to feel a little bit disheartened by that particular process, is what I'm getting at. It can be frustrating.
It can be frustrating to feel like what's happening is confusion and confront that it might not be that. No, that's not what you mean.
Mm-mm. No. Just confusion is frustrating.
Maybe it's just a thing I don't really relate to. I don't, for better or worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's possible. Like, I don't believe that we all have the exact same experience.
Well, obviously not. Yeah. Trap number 5 is that pesky pendulum thing again that we talked about in the last episode. And we were trying to get at how when we start to do a new thing, make decisions in a new way, or alter our behavior or our pattern of thinking, that frequently we find that we like overshoot the mark, we overcompensate, and we go from one extreme to the other.
Mm-hmm.
And this how that goes seems so useful to be able to identify. And it's another thing that I think I still count on the people around me to help notice. I still don't have a great ability to see that my own thinking or choices are being very extreme one way to the other way. And having other people around me to get feedback from is another occasion where that's really helped. And the part of the benefit of identifying this like very drastic swing from one end of the other is that just noticing that, oh wow, that's really extreme, has supported me in finding something in between the extremes, mm-hmm. which is usually what has been indicated for me. Mm-hmm. Just like even the registering for class thing, just like it wasn't the right thing to take 20 credits a quarter, and it wasn't the right thing to take 3 credits a quarter, which are both things that at various times Paige, like Paige, I thought I should be doing. And that it was frequently something between 3 and 20 that was the right fit.
Mm-hmm. We could relate the feeling of confusion to this idea of dualistic thinking or extreme thinking. My experience in confusion, I think, kind of, well, at least part of it stems from wanting to feel certain. Like wanting, like you say, the burning bush experience, and waiting for that and not having that, and instead of just sort of maybe relying on that sense of deep knowing. And so I think that might just be another example of a cognitive distortion or of dualistic or extreme thinking.
I think that's a good point. I think I also heard something in what you just said about how it's easy to be attached to not making mistakes, mm-hmm. and that really can warp our readiness to experiment or have a sense about maybe what our conscience is asking of us and to go with it, mm-hmm. and then be ready to say, oh, no, I guess that wasn't the thing. Mm-hmm. Or, you know what I mean? Like this being lightly attached is, again, in conflict with extreme thinking.
Right. And if you're in a relationship with someone where you're like checking in with them and about this stuff, like at least my experience, like in our relationship, if I'm in a place where I'm like, hey, Paige, I don't know what to do. Should I skip my home group and go to a Mariners game with this guy I'm dating or not? And you're like, I don't know. That's your decision to make. And then I sit in my house and I'm confused. And then I go skip my home group.
You never told me. I don't think you ever told me what you actually did.
For sure, I skipped my home group and I went to hang with him. And like the day was just like riddled with weird stuff, which could be interpreted as like signs that it wasn't the right decision. Who knows? I'm not a superstitious. Like, I don't want to give into like superstition, but the point is like, it's okay that maybe that wasn't the right thing to do. It's just
you have survived. You're intact.
Right.
Nobody died that we know of as a result of this mistake.
And if you're thinking that, like for me, it's probably not a coincidence that like we didn't have a follow-up on that conversation. I probably just didn't want to tell you that, like, I don't know, maybe I didn't do the right thing, you know, or whatever. Like,
I'm glad you brought that up as an occasion of when you did feel like you were confused and you took action to try to get it cleared up, in part by being in touch with me. Mm-hmm. And
I'm still not sure.
Well, if this isn't too woo-woo to say, I am not of the mind that there is just one tiny, narrow path for us to walk that's the right way.
Right.
My sense is that there might even be, this is going to sound wild, an infinite number of ways to proceed that are good and right. Mm-hmm. For me, that's what has worked and is empowering as a way to think about this.
Right.
So it's not about hitting on the one and only way of proceeding.
And if you are trying to hit that, you might be attached to some outcome.
Right. And is this not just more of this dualistic extreme thinking? Right. So for me, reminding myself and others that there is an array, I mean, that it looks to me like it's likely that there is an array of good, right ways to proceed is really empowering and useful.
Okay. We will undoubtedly come back to these topics again, but that's all for now. Thank you for joining us. The show isn't a thing without you. Please find us online, chime in, write to us. We are listening for how to best serve. We are on Instagram, Facebook, SoundCloud, and Twitter, all at C12Pod. That's C12Pod. It looks to us as though our community could really use this content, and we're excited to create and share it. This is a 100% listener-supported show, so if you already like what you're hearing, or even if you don't, but you think what we're up to is good, please contribute through Patreon at patreon.com/C12Pod. And support us by subscribing to our show through whichever tool you use to listen to podcasts, and submit a review on iTunes and Facebook or wherever you listen to the show. We're hosting Discord spaces for patrons and will include a Dear Citizen segment in future shows, so support us and write in with your questions about practicing the principles of the steps.
Our thanks to each of you who contribute to this work. Thank you.
Thank you.